This video is going to be about shading the areas of the face around the features in a front view portrait. So I've already done the demonstration on this, on all the features, from the eyes and eyebrows to the nose, the mouth, the ears. When we did the mouth, we also did a little bit of the jawline and that area. So now we're going to be doing the cheeks, cheekbones, forehead, etc. So I have a couple of different self-portraits here. I've been using this more recent one, but for this demo, I'm going to start with this one because my hair is pulled off my face. So if you have a hairstyle where you have bangs that are covering some of your forehead, you might be kind of skipping some of the stuff I'm going to do for the forehead, but for a lot of you, you'll need to shade that area. So first I'm going to look at establishing the outer boundaries of the face. So we talked a little bit when we did the ears about the cheekbones, and in this one we're also going to talk about the hairline. So we're not really going to do the hair yet, but we will start to talk about the hairline. All right, so establishing that, you're going to look at the shape of your hairline. First of all, we have that established up here. We found that when we were doing the proportions of the face. So we said that from the brow to the nose was the middle third, and then going from the brow up, we'd have the hairline. So that does get that maybe a little bit higher than I did before. That may mean that things have shifted around. So you may want to take that measurement again. For some of you, you found that your eyebrows were higher than you originally had placed them. So this is just about individual kind of differences in the face. You can also kind of look at measuring on your photo. And in one way or another, you can take your fingers or your pencil tip up to your photo and look and see, okay, how does that brow line to forehead ratio compare with that distance and this distance, to help find that a little bit. So looking at the measurements of my face, I'll put this kind of right in between. It is important to remember, though, that your forehead may be bigger than you think it is. And that's not a bad thing. It'll look very odd if you start your hairline too close to your eyebrows, unless you've got bangs. Okay, so once you've decided how high up is that going to be, you're going to look at the overall shape. So, so you could, again, if you're working from a photo reference, you could even kind of trace that shape. You're going to want to look at, oh, my pen seems to be failing me. So, but you get the idea. You can also even look at that where the part is as well. So you can look at where the part is. So for me, it's over here. Yours might be closer to the center. All right, so those are some of the things that I'm looking for. And finally, too, you might see I have a little bit of a dip here at the center of the hairline. Some people will have more of a dip or a widow's peak. All right, so our basic shape will likely be something like this. And remember, you will have a little bit of hair showing here near the ears, unless you are bald or have your hair very closely shaved to your head. So that's kind of our basic shape. And then, again, I'm going to look for sort of small differences in that. So you might be able to see kind of where that part is over here. For me, like I said, I might have this little bit of a dip of my hairline, a tiny bit of a widow's peak. Over here, you might see kind of a shape like this. All right, and I have a little bit, moving my cursor, I have a little bit of that same thing happening on this side. So basically got that type of shape. Don't worry about making that a really hard line because those are made up of hairs. This will have a little bit of a softness or a texture to that when we finish the hairline. But at least now we've got the basic shape. Okay, now we're going to look a little bit at the planes of the head. So I have over here this reference, which is a planar analysis of a front view head. So this just helps us see kind of a generalized version of where do the planes of the face kind of protrude a bit. So I could lay these same lines over top of my portrait. So for example, we've got these kinds of planes in the face here where the cheekbones start to curve around. We've got the chin sticking out. And then up here we have the brow line coming out front, and we've got the eye sockets going back. Now the reason I'm pulling this up is because of what's happening here at the forehead. So just to kind of keep going with this, these lines right here, those are going to have a plane change in here. So in other words, this part of the forehead is kind of flat, and then here the head goes back here and here. Another area where you're going to see a plane change on here is this part right here. So this space where the brow line and the nose connect right in here. So there, the forehead or that space is starting to kind of slope down toward the nose. So if we're looking at the head in profile, you have this happening right there. So some of these things are going to help indicate shadows. It's supposed to be my nose, by the way. All right. So coming back here, we're going to go ahead and start to use some of that information. All right, so before I start shading, again, I want to make sure that I have these sides of my face where I want them to be. So I had mentioned in the tutorial where I was doing the ears that my cheekbones kind of stick out a little bit more here. And I'm going to kind of keep working on that. I wanted to make sure the ears showed. So I didn't actually bring those out quite as much as I wanted to. So I'm just going to reshape the face a little bit. So this is kind of your last best opportunity to kind of look at the shape of your face and make changes. And if you are making changes, make sure you're looking at making these symmetrical. So if I'm having my cheekbones pop out, I'm looking at that widest part being the same. All right, and again, this is going to vary person to person. So you may see that the sides of your face are smoother, flatter, more of a continuous curve or angle. So this is not something you're necessarily copying exactly, but you're looking at your own reference photo to see, okay, what does the shape of my face do? So again, trying to see, okay, where is that widest part popping out? And do I have that pretty symmetrical? All right. Now that I've got that, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start to add some shading around the edges first. So whenever we're doing these curved forms, this part that's at the sides of the curve can be a little bit darker, and the part that's popping out towards you can be a little bit lighter. So going back to that cylinder idea, if this is my cylinder, if I have kind of even lighting, shading, something like that will make my cylinder look more 3D. Okay, we also did the sphere drawing and we talked about reflected light on there. So rather than necessarily shading right up to the edge or shading at our darkest right at the edge, I might leave it slightly lighter on the sides and make it just a little bit darker, a little bit to the side there. So this can be light gray and this just slightly darker. Now, speaking of how dark or how light you're going to do the shading, we are going for form here. So no matter how light or how dark your skin is, you want to have areas that are darker and lighter. So if you have dark skin, you're not going to simply shade it in dark. We're depicting value, so it's more about the light hitting it. That said, if your skin is dark or medium, you might be making your dark areas darker than I am, since my skin is on the light side. Okay, so I've done a little bit of shading here. I used my 2B pencil, which means it'll blend pretty well, but not overblend. So I can just then blend that in a little bit. And while I'm working too, you may have noticed that I had my paper towel up at some point, so I'm not smudging other blending that I've done. If you haven't done this part down here, same approach down here. We're doing a little bit of shading and then leaving it just a smidge lighter at the edge. And then underneath the chin, I started right at the edge and shaded out onto the neck a little bit. So that was in the mouth tutorial. If these areas, however, aren't blending well, you might find that you have to go back in and do a little more shading here to connect them. So when I say blending, in that case, I mean just looking like they're all done at the same time. All right, so I didn't have to do too much shading. I kept it pretty light. Again, the pigment of my skin is fairly light. If you want your skin to be darker, then you would go a little bit darker, but you still need to make sure that you're leaving this area in here some white space. This area is where the cheekbone is going to pop out the most. You might find that shading underneath this area, if your cheekbones do pop out quite a bit, you might add a little bit of shading there. So doing something like that could make the cheekbones pop out a little bit more. And if any of this starts to look weird, it might just be that you're going too dark or having too much contrast. If you want to go dark because your skin is darker in pigment, but it looks weird, you might find that you have to darken up other areas of shading that you've done so that it kind of matches or keeps consistent. But when you do that, make sure that you still leave some highlights in areas where the forms are popping out more. Okay, now same idea around this part of the forehead. So I'm going to, I could go right up to this edge, but especially if your hair is dark, again, you may want to start a little bit out from the edge. So the face kind of has a lot of these softer, rounded features. So we're not as often going right up to the edges for crisp edges. Lots of areas where we want a softer, subtler kind of edge. If you want it to be a really crisp edge, then you have to start right at the line. And if you can see this, you can see I'm using a little bit of hatching. So that can be a way to go. That'll also kind of give it a softer look, and then you can blend it to smooth it out a little bit. So I'm going to go around the rest of the forehead in a similar way. Again, I'm using the 2B, which lets me blend a little bit more. If I've got a little bit of an underdrawing still in here, I can go ahead and get rid of that. One thing you may notice, I'm holding my pencil in my hand rather than having it on the tip of my pencil. That just gives me more control. And it's one of the things that allows me to keep one eraser that's really pointy and another that's maybe older that's not. And I don't lose the point on my pointy eraser as fast because I'm not using it for everything. Okay, and if this gets a little bit too dark in some areas, again, I can just come in here and erase a little bit. So I'm not erasing everything I've done, but I'm essentially hatching with my eraser. And then if I need to blend that out again, I would go back in. I might fold this to an area that's still clean. So that could mean folding it in backwards or just using a different corner of it. Okay, now we talked about how these side planes happen here. So again, I'm going to add a little bit of shading here. And notice that's going to be about in line with this part of the eyebrow we talked about, the arch of the eyebrow. So around the end of the eye / arch of the eyebrow, that's where the head starts to curve back. So if you think of the skeleton, you've got those big open eye sockets. That's where the eye socket ends. All right, so I've done a little bit of shading there and there. So notice I'm keeping my paper towel over the face so I'm not smudging it. All right, and then this area right between the eyebrows, that too. So we kind of shaded up to there when we were doing the nose. Now I'm going to complete that shadow up here. So starting here, it'll be a little darker. And notice I'm not shading right up to these edges because again, I want to have some contrast. I'm seeing too that I have a little bit of underdrawing left from when I had my line of symmetry probably at some point. So I just got rid of that. All right, let's see if that's enough shading there. So if I decide I've got maybe a little too much light in there between, then I might add a little bit more shading. So we still want to make sure that we've got some crispness here. So this area will be somewhat defined. So I'm just making sure that we don't lose some of this other shading that we've done. All right, so that's looking pretty good. That might be all you need. I do find, so depending on how much your brow ridge sticks out here, and if you look at the skeleton in the classroom, you may see how the bone of the skull sticks out right here and then goes back a little bit here. So if you see this and you can see that definition on my selfie here, then you might want to add a little bit of shadowing here. Now that said, I don't want to make that too noticeable. I'm actually going to do that with my dirty blending tool. If your blending tool isn't dirty enough, you could take a darkish pencil on a scrap of paper and just do this and then rub your blending tool on that to get it a little darker. I think mine might be fine how it is. So I would just go up here, just a little bit above the eyebrows, not right next to them, but a little bit above. And I'm essentially drawing with my blending tool. I don't know that I'm getting enough of a of a mark there. So I'm just going to, I just did this to make my blending tool a little dirtier. And there you go. Now you can really see that. In fact, it might be too much. And again, if you add some shading and it's too much, you've got two choices. You can go darker in some of the other areas, and that'll make that look by comparison more normal or light or medium. Or you can simply, of course, semi-erase what you've done. So, and I would just work on that until I was happy. So again, once I've erased a little bit, I might need to go back and blend. And this time I folded my blending tool. So again, I'm using a cleaner part now. Or you could keep different blending tools. All right, so that is pretty much the face. Before I end this tutorial, I am going to go ahead and I'm going to shade a little bit on the neck as well. So first thing I'm going to do again is erase some of these guidelines. You may want to take 1 second here to make sure, again, that the neck is the right width. Does it look just a little bit thinner than the jawline? You may have to make it slightly thicker or slightly thinner. And again, this will depend a little bit on the person you're drawing. And then you might need to make sure, okay, is this changing the slope into the shoulders? Is that occurring at the same place? Okay, so once you think you have that, then you're going to look, depending on your collar line. If your collar is up here, you won't see the collarbone, but if it's a little lower, you may see the collarbone. So that's going to be, essentially, I'm going to actually have you lightly draw in. So I'm going to make sure I'm using my HB. Lightly draw in here. I'm going to extend these down and then add the bottom of an ellipse here. Draw these really lightly because these won't stay. But this is essentially what's happening here with the form. You've got a cylinder that's kind of embedded in and sitting on top of your shoulders. So it's kind of attached with these muscles here. And then it's sitting on the shoulders. All right, and then right sort of where that attaches, that's then where your collarbone is. So you have a bone coming out here and a bone coming out here, and this is where those two end, and there's kind of a space in between. All right, so if you see that part, then you can do a line here and a line here. All right, and I'm going to start lightly erasing that. The other thing, if we're looking at our planar analysis, they also have a line here and here. These are just showing the side planes of the neck. And kind of the structure of the neck with the windpipe in the middle, you'll see that here and here. So I'm going to go ahead and add very lightly again those side planes. All right, so we're going to start shading like our cylinder. So essentially the two sides, and then leaving it light here. You may have a little bit of lightness on either side as it's curving around, so that reflected light. And whether or not you're leaving that may depend on your reference photo. It may depend on where your hair is. So if your hair is dark, you may really want to leave that so that you've got some contrast. And if your hair is covering some of your neck, you may find that you cover some of this. All right, but in any case, just starting with my 2B. So again, I'm not shading right up to the neck. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get rid of that line we did. So those sort of imaginary cylinder lines. So those were just showing us the form. So I can go ahead and go up to this edge here. And feel free, if your collar starts here, so you're wearing a t-shirt where the collar is here, you may be kind of stopping your shading there. All right, and here, so I can, again, erase these lines, but we may find that that's sort of where our shading goes up to. So again, I'm very lightly shading in to that area, very lightly, very lightly. I'm realizing here, really, I probably should have shaded the opposite direction. So all of these kind of, if I put them together, we'd have kind of this curving form. So if I would actually kind of come back here and angle this way. So we'd have that sort of curve going around the neck, just like the ellipse. All right. If I need to go a little bit darker here, I can add a little bit of shading. So again, this is just to blend the shadow we did underneath the chin. So I'm just making sure that that is consistent. If I need to erase that a little bit, if it's too dark, I could. So I'm just wanting to make this look consistent, like I did it all at once. While I'm at it, if you do see the collarbone, I would shade inward to either side of the collarbone. And you may see some other shadows here if you do have a reference. So I might also lightly shade here, lightly shade here, because you can see there's some area where there's like highlights too, where the light is catching. And if you do have a reference photo, this is an area where this is an example of having a reference photo can be really useful. I can get much more specific with this shading and kind of see, okay, where exactly is that shading to one side, and then where does it get a little bit lighter, and then where does it get a little bit darker here. On this side, maybe it's actually catching more light a little bit on that side, and then getting darker here and getting a little bit more shadowed here. So that's one of the nice things about having a photo that really freezes things in exactly what they looked like in one moment in time, and you can really see that very clearly without movement getting in the way. And you will see that kind of specificity going all the way back to the Baroque period, so just after the Renaissance, because that early they were starting to understand mirrors and lenses, and they had the camera obscura, which was a very early version of the camera. They couldn't yet make the image stick on a piece of paper. So they didn't have photographs, but they were able to project an image onto, say, a wall or other blank surface. And then they could look at that and really, they could trace from it onto a sheet of paper, or just really see very clearly all of that detail. So going all the way back to the 1600s, they were already using what amounts to drawing from photographs, if you will. Okay. All right. That I think does it for all that shading. One thing you could add, if you are a male or if you're drawing a male, You could also put in an Adam's apple. So right here, you would shade a little bit. I'm not going to do that as I'm drawing myself. I'm drawing a female, but you could do that if you were drawing a man. All right, you can ask me in class if you want to know more about that.